All right. And so, yeah, so we'll talk really briefly about the project. And the reason why, again, I want to let you guys know this because this is the first project you'll be just basically picking your own data set. So there's some criteria in there. And I actually know, I'm going to share my screen in 1 second, but I think you guys have all at least kind of browsed through a little bit of what the curriculum shows for the requirements for the project. And again, I just want to kind of very briefly walk through parts of that just to kind of point things you should pay attention to. But overall, this project will be a machine learning project. So that means you will need to have certain data. Well, it helps if you have certain data requirements in this, but I wanted to point out a couple of things that it kind of says in here, which we're not going to quite go with. We're going to go with a little bit different criteria, but it'll end up helping you in the long run. Okay, so one big thing is like selecting your data set. So give some some extra things, some guidelines to help you out. It says like you should be work for classification. I will say is that you can, and I have seen people do this project on unsupervised learning, which means more about clustering than classification. So classification usually means that we have a target variable and we know how to classify each one. So that's going to kind of stay pretty, this is what most people will do. But if you find a compelling project or data where you'd like to try to do unsupervised learning, that's perfectly good too. Those tends to be a little more easily understood. So people tend to gravitate towards this direction. Note that it needs to be complex enough. I cannot stress this enough, is that if your data is not complex enough, it's just it's one of those things where like, if it's too simple, you can technically do it and it'll be fine, but you're probably not going to get very much meaning for it. And I would say like this project's a great way to like really practice out like, hey, let me try out some of the skills that we learned, let me try out a little bit of feature engineering, like, do I have to scale things and stuff? Do I have to worry about class imbalance? If it's too simple, you just won't have honestly like that much to gain from the project. So that's kind of why I say like avoid the simplicity. And then note that there's things like these common data sets like Titanic, the IRIS data set. So that's the one that I keep using over and over again. MNIST, which is the handwritten data set. Basically ones that you typically see in tutorials of any kind of like machine learning stuff. Avoid those kind of things. They've just been overdone so much that I think you could get more benefit. And honestly, like part of your project is like you can put it out as your portfolio project. So it'd be a nice thing to be able to point out. If you basically have a project and it's on a Titanic set or on the IRIS data set, people are just kind of say, oh, that's cool. Like, because everyone's been doing that so often. So I think find something interesting that you find interesting as well. You have your own interest in, whatever you're drawn towards. And note that it says it's okay if the data set is mostly clean. I would highly recommend getting a clean data set. This project is, you guys have the typical week-long project weeks kind of stuff. You don't want to spend half of that week just on cleaning the data. That just means it's just not going to be as, what's it called? It's just going to take a lot more time. On a real data science project, yes, you will have to actually clean data. Stuff like that, that's very common. But since we're focusing most on the machine learning aspect, try to find clean data sets. And I'll talk about today where you can find those kind of nice, clean data sets. Yeah, it says don't pick too complex. We'll talk about this. No natural language processing, no computer vision. So make sure like those parts, avoid these things. There are things that you can do specifically for Capstone, but for a week long for introducing a machine learning project, these just have extra stuff that we just haven't even discussed about how to approach these topics.
So we're not supposed to know what that is right now, or like how to do.
If you're like, what is natural language processing?
Like,
it's like, yeah,
what is that? Okay.
Yeah. So think anything like with words essentially is what an NLP is. That could be different languages or English or whatnot. Computer vision, basically images. There's some image stuff you could do, but I'd recommend staying away from it because you either won't get very good results or you'll be really frustrated with how to make it work. Let's see here. Yeah, don't worry too much. It's serious bonus points, third-party API. If you find something like, using an API and incorporate it into your project, awesome. Don't stress out about this. I would say only do this in the sense that if you find an interesting data set or if you're doing it. And this is where I'll say is that this is going to be something that you guys will find a data set and have it approved by me. That way you're not wasting a whole bunch of time working on this project. And I looked at it, I'm like, oh, like that's going to be really difficult, or oh, like that's going to take a lot more time than you're expecting. So basically, if you're not sure about something, send it over, and then I'm going to approve your data set anyway. So kind of approach it that way.
When, like, should we have you approve our data set by Friday, do you think, Victor?
I would say actually by Monday would be the latest, but I know most of you all will probably start looking for data sets. So if you want to approve it before then, say, hey, like I found this data set and you give it to me on Thursday or Friday, I think that'd be great because then you can start working on the weekend for the project if you're, feeling caught up in everything, which I think most of you guys are feeling pretty confident in moving through the material. Yeah. Okay. But I would say definitely Monday at the latest. Like on Monday, I should have like, if I haven't approved your data set, we should be talking and prove it through. Okay. This is where I'm gonna go against a little bit of it here, and I have a little slideshow that we talk about. So the main thing is, this is true. Don't use one that we already worked in labs because like, duh, we already used in labs. So like, it's not kind of like making it any special. But also this part right here is what I want to change. It says a minimum 1,000 rows. I and the other instructors would say really don't agree with this 1,000 rows. We think that's way too small for a machine learning project. And to get a useful machine learning project, it's either this is going to be really easy or it's going to be really difficult and you're not going to get any like decent results. So 1,000 is just too small. So we'll talk about a little bit what it is, but I say around 50,000 is really what you're supposed to look for in this kind of project. And then it should contain a minimum of 10 predictor columns before any one hot encoding. So basically this 10 predictor columns is saying there should be 10 features, whether that's categorical or numerical. I'm going to add a little bit more to this too. I would say that you should focus more on numerical parts for this project just because there's nothing wrong with categorical variables, but it ends up being, there's a few reasons why, and we'll get over that in a second. And then of course, approval. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about how to find this data set. And then there's a few options here. These are some great things. I also have another option here that you guys might want to check out. And then your typical deliverables, Jupyter Notebook, your README, blog posts, PowerPoint presentation. This one right here is going to be a little more, your presentation is going to probably feel a little more technical, but you should still be able to make it towards a non-technical person of like what your results are. So you can talk about your process going forward and say, what you did, like, different models you did. And then, but still you want to present that information that's digestible to someone who's not as non-technical. And also, of course, pull out your recommendations from that too. Okay, cool. Any questions on this general thing besides actually finding the data set? Okay, cool. So I have a little presentation that another instructor had put together. So I'm going to go ahead and present this guy. And actually, you guys can see, let's see, could you guys see that when it was full screen? Okay, cool. I'm going to keep you guys off to the side here so I can make sure if there's any, you guys can give a thumbs up or whatnot. So again, this wasn't something that I put together, but I think for the most part, I pretty much agree with it. So basically, this is to like pick up topics. So you guys really get to do in this project whatever you really want to that's interesting to you. And I would say make it interesting to you. If there's a specific industry that you would like to kind of go into, you can kind of gear towards that too. Typically this project tends to go, okay, so typically what I'll see is people will choose a project here and they really enjoy it and they want to expand it even further into their capstone. So that's entirely possible too. So but I would say most thing is, use it to play around with a little bit. Think of it like, how you can make it interesting. If you were to bring this to an interview and say, oh, tell me about a machine learning project you've done or a data science project. And you can say, well, I've done this thing. Like you want to be interested in it, not something that seems, quote unquote, boring to you, but maybe interesting to someone else. Okay, cool. So let's hear it. So real quick, I'm not going to go through this whole stuff. Also note that these mod 1, mod 2, this is actually from like the version 1 stuff. So kind of ignore like the exact timings on this, but basically the main thing about like project topic is that you're going to have your own like decision on how you want to decide on this. So when you see mod 3, think of mod 5. It's a little different order in how we do the project now. But main thing, like I say, is like if you can think of it like how it really like it ties into a place you want to go into industry, and if you don't know, that's perfectly fine. But if you know something like, oh, I want to go in this part of the industry, think of projects that would be related to that industry, and that will be helpful in that way. So I'm kind of reading this a little bit. This is where my presentations, I don't like doing too much text, so this was me. But let's see here. Your data are two of the most contacts. Yeah, just think of like, you really get to decide everything on this part. Okay, and just so you guys know, I'll send you guys a copy of this presentation so you guys don't have to like take notes right now and all that stuff, or read everything through. Okay, so main thing, like you said, like if you really don't know what to do, you can think of things like you want to do like professional experience, right? So like if you want to go into finance, retail, real estate, transportation, or you can talk about things that you are really like personally enjoy or passionate about or find interesting, go for it. There's a lot of people, for example, who really like sports, but they might not necessarily want to do that in the personal experience, but they're really interested in it. They are knowledgeable in that part. They can pursue in this part. There's also a bunch of other things you can do too, or just you find interesting. So again, the main idea I would say here is that you either want to put it in a frame of like something that where you want to interview would be interesting to them, or something that's interesting to you, so you can talk about it. I would personally say this tends to stand out a little bit easier if you're interested in this over just trying to make something that's professionally experienced, especially your first project. Just because if you find something that might be interesting to them, like finding, let's just say, finding your project is looking for fraudulent transactions, in like a list of like transactions, stuff like that. That might be really important in the sense of like what you're doing here. But if you can't really like talk much about it and really explain the nuances because you're not really that excited about it, it's just not going to stand out very well in an interview. So I strongly suggest, like, if you have to pick between these two, pick the one that you're most passionate about. Okay, cool. All right. So some criteria. So this is the stuff that's going to be slightly different from what was in the curriculum. And so one thing I'll say is 50,000 rows, like minimum, that's not a strict minimum, but like about 50,000 rows, basically data points for the data set, okay? I would say at least 8 continuous features. So note that like that means numerical. So this means that this just makes it easier in the sense of trying to do classification because there's more room for these values to differ. If you have most of your features categorical, so like right here it says no more than 50% categorical features. If you tend to have categorical features, there's not a way to say like, well, if it's between this category and this category. And for some situations that makes a lot of sense. But what tends to happen with data sets that are more categorical, it ends up being that the target is more or less basically by definition whatever the categories are. Or the opposite happens where there's just not enough information. So this is where I say really focus on having continuous features as much as possible. And I say at least 50%, and you should really have like 8 features, 8 continuous features in general, if that makes sense. So I would say like minimum like 10 features, but 10 features is kind of like 10 features like total, like including categorical. That's kind of like a little smaller. The more features you have, the more interesting parts you can get into your data. Okay. Any questions on that? Okay, cool. And then little note here, avoid do-it-yourself data sets. Basically any data that you have to collect yourself in some like besides just downloading it, it's just going to add more time to it. So if that's something you do want to do, like say, hey, there's some really interesting data or some really interesting problem I want to pursue, but it means I have to collect the data and maybe aggregate it together or some kind of thing like that. I would say save that for your capstone. And we can talk about that too. If you're like really set on doing this data set, maybe we can do something that's similar to this, starting off in this project, and then we can kind of use that information to help you with your capstone if that's something you really want to do. Okay, and note that like the typical formats, CSV, SQLite databases, JSON, or API, those are all pretty typical, and those are relatively straightforward for you guys to pull the data from. Cool. So that's this is a little bit different criteria than what the curriculum has on there, but I think this will overall actually help you have a decent project that's going to challenge you, but also not so challenging that you're stuck. Okay. So again, some things to avoid. This was kind of mentioned in the curriculum. Avoid natural language processing. Words in language are very complicated. There's ways to approach it, but it's not something we really talked about. Computer vision, basically things with images, image detection. You can technically do some of these things with the tools that we have, but they don't tend to perform very well, or they're just too simple. So it's either like, oh, it's really easy for you to, you can do it with these machine learning algorithms, but it means it's too simple, or it's too complicated and it's going to be difficult. Plus, one thing with computer vision is that you have to usually pull in image data, and image data is not something we've really worked with yet. And so I think that would be something that's going to add an extra complexity beyond just doing the machine learning. Again, if these are things that are interesting to you, like if you're interested in natural language processing or interested in something with image detection or something with images, computer vision, then what's it called? We can do that for capstone and talk about that. Okay. Again, DIY, do it yourself data sets. I'll try to avoid those as much as possible. Combining is fine, but if you have to combine like, 100 different data sets to create your data set, maybe this is not the route to go. Okay, at least for this project. And then anything that requires human input, if you have to do something like collect the data, it's like, oh, I can get the data, but I have to like manually download, like click buttons or something to get this data. Like, like when I say like get this data, like a lot of different buttons, like I can imagine I've gone to places where like literally you have to essentially copy and paste each, part and then put it over. It's just, if there's anything that takes too much time to get the data, it's probably not a good idea for at least this project. These are some sectors that at least the past instructor kind of found that are a little hard with this project. He said education data tends to be a little staggered, like kind of like it's not super clear sometimes. So I've worked with some education data and I can kind of see what he's saying is that a lot of data from education can be kind of just not right. Just not right. It takes a lot of cleaning. Government programs, sometimes government programs can have like very specific things and it's kind of tough to dig for this information. I would say though, if you find the data set from like, a government website and freely sourced data, that might be a really good thing to do. But at least from his experience, he found these two areas really bad. Science, this one I would say, yeah, this makes sense. Unless you really have the background to understand the material, probably avoid really like scientific data just because it can be really intimidating, not just intimidating, but also like you have to do your research and stuff to understand what the data comes from. So that's the main reason why you're avoiding these sectors, is because they can be very deep in their own terminology and such. But of course, if you have experience in any of these, or if you find a data set that looks pretty decent and you can understand it well, there's no reason to avoid these completely. Okay. Cool. Any questions on any of these things to avoid? No? Okay, cool. So one suggestion, has anyone used Trello or something like a Kanban board or anything like that? See some head shakes. Okay, so maybe this is something we can talk about for maybe like next week or even Friday feels. But this is a great way to kind of organize your information. This is really good for doing like capstone and stuff like this. So we'll talk about that. I just think it's funny. Yeah, instructor said like really avoid DIY data sets. I think he's had some problems in the past where people really want to do their own data set, which is exciting, but also means you just don't have much time. Yeah, so I'm just wanting to see if there's anything else in here. Say project cleanup, additional info during break at the end, of course. Yeah, if there's some project you're like, oh man, this would be really interesting data, but like it's gonna take me some time. Keep it kind of like in like your backlog, like save bookmark it or save it aside to maybe do a capstone or explore that into the capstone, especially if you find it really interesting. Okay. So here's where you can get some data. So all of these sources are shown on, what's it called? On the curriculum. I think Data World might not be, but that's also an option here. So what's nice about this is that this tends to already have aggregated sites. UC Irvine's machine learning data sets are a really great one. Know though that a lot of UCI data sets are relatively small too, so kind of be aware of that. Kaggle, Kaggle like also has data sets, so Kaggle's not just competitions. They actually have some great data sets you can use on there. And there's some other stuff you can find, like you can find lots of data sets on GitHub. This is actually a repo with like specific publicly available data sets, so that's kind of a cool one to check out. You can see some other things, data.world, and then let's see, I think yeah, this is the last thing, but one I wanted to show that I love using, I always forget the actual URL. So I just call it Google Data Search. So toolbox.google.com/data search. So this guy right here is really fun because if you want to say, let's say I want to find something about biking data, or let's say cycling. It's basically a search engine for data sets. So it's kind of cool because it also will find things like using Data World here. You can see here, there's some public websites. Sometimes you'll find government, like you see data.gov.uk here, and you can basically get it just helps you find data sets that exist. They also search for Kaggle data sets too here. We can see there's a whole bunch of information on here, and you can actually search depending on like what you're really looking for. So it's kind of a fun way to kind of explore a little bit, and then you just go to the website itself. And sometimes the website will have it easily accessible, sometimes it's not as easily accessible. So you can see here, basically, you might have to download, you might have to look at some additional metadata here. You might have to look at like what's in this and all this stuff, but it kind of helps see like what's available and what's out there. Okay. And then Kaggle.com data sets right here. Oh, I didn't know this was a little tag right here. I've never seen this before, so I don't know. But you can search for data sets on here as well. And what's nice about Kaggle, when you actually pull up data sets, you can see it once it kind of loads up. They will also give you a little bit of distribution up here, and whether it's categorical or numerical and such like this. So you can see here, for example, there's date, and you can see there's a distribution of date with basically like a little bit of example going on here. So you can kind of see a little bit of what this data looks like. The more balanced the data is, the easier it is. Otherwise, we can get into some other issues and stuff, but this is something we can talk about as you guys look for data sets. But it's kind of nice for you to kind of quickly look at this. You can see how many columns there are and everything like that. You can select which one you want. So, and then what's also nice about Kaggle too is that you can also see this kernels part. You can see what other people have done. So this might be especially nice for starting off the project, just to see like, you know, what did other people do? Like, what did they find? And see like how they approach this, and see kind of their exploration and kind of like what they go through. I would still kind of warn you in the sense of like not being too, like it's perfectly fine to go through these, but there definitely can be easily influence you on like how you approach the data set. But I think this would be a good one to kind of like, you know, even if you like start doing the exploration, get an idea, it's like, what did other people do? Or if you're really stuck, just to see what did other people do with data sets like this or a completely different data set. I don't know if this ML friendly public data sets. Oh, okay.
Victor,
yeah.
What did you mean when you say a balanced data set?
Oh yeah. So a balanced data set basically means that you tend to have about the same number of things or instances of each class. So like, let's say your target is class A, class B, class C. If you only have like 90% of your data is in class A, and then like 10%, let's say like 8% is like in class B, and then 2% is in class C. The thing that the machine learning algorithm will tend to go towards, some algorithms do better than others, but one thing that will tend to happen is they'll just keep guessing A, regardless of whatever the attributes are. And basically you'll get really great accuracy, but it will basically make a bunch of false positives, or if you're thinking of class A, but basically it'll make a bunch of mistakes by just guessing at class A. There's some ways we can kind of circumvent that. So that's why, like, you know, when you find a data set, don't worry too much about that, because we can talk about ways you can kind of like deal with that, or, you know, at least see how well your model does and see if there needs to be something like data generation where you have to essentially oversample or undersample the data set. Make sense? Cool. So anyway, this is where you can find some data sets. I really like using Kaggle because it's a great community that people will, like, you know, show a little bit of what they've done before. But kind of going back real quick, kind of the last slide, are there any questions about this kind of project overall, between picking data sets or what you'll have to do?
Well, I guess so. Like when we looked at one of the examples of what someone did for machine learning, would you say like once we start the project, it's pretty, I don't know, like for instance, module 1, that project was really long, and module 2 was like really long because we did it. So I guess it kind of depends on if we're just picking one question. Like I feel like this could be kind of a shorter exploration or like machine learning project. And part of it is just like figuring out the data and like setting it up and pre-processing, and then you just fit it. But I guess, yeah, just kind of your thoughts on like the overall structure of what the results will look like.
Yeah, I think generally people find this relatively straightforward. I would say like Mod 1's probably the most, probably the most intimidating project overall, with how much work you have to do. For this project, the main focus is not for you to do cleaning the data. That's why we suggest these different, you know, Kaggle or UCI, things that have already been cleaned for you, so you don't have to worry about that aspect in it. A big part of this basically is just going to say, you know, can you get this machine learning model? Can you model on this data set? So that might involve some feature engineering. So kind of like maybe saying, okay, like, well, I need to one hot encode these categories, or I need to do some scaling, or possibly, you know, generate new features from these combined features or something like that. But for the most part, it's going to be kind of setting that up and then saying, okay, let me go ahead, do the model. And I would suggest, one thing I would highly suggest is doing something like a grid search, which I don't think we've talked about yet. I think this mentioned in the next section, section 38, when we start talking, no, I'm sorry, section 39, I think, when we start doing pipelines. But
They sort
you
of
could
talk about it in
oh, they talk about
37
it.
too. Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah. So this is I would suggest trying that out. Try basically multiple models. So like, you know, do a random forest, but also try to support vector machine, or, you know, try different models and see how well they perform in different parameters. And I think this is a good place for you to kind of test out. So this is kind of like again, it's like your first machine learning project here. So that's going to be the most focus. But I think for the most part, people are kind of like, oh yeah, this felt very like straightforward once they got the flow of everything. So,
Okay. Thank you.
yeah, no problem. Okay. Any other questions? No? Okay, cool. So I'll get start recording here, and then we'll go right into our section for the day.